The air inside the community hall was thick and smelled faintly of stale coffee and the lemon-scented cleaner used on the tiled floors. It was not a pleasant smell, but it was a familiar one to the people who sat in the semicircle of plastic chairs. They were the committee members, the people who made the decisions for the town. They were chatting in low voices, checking their phones, and tapping their pens against their clipboards. They were waiting for the meeting to really start, but mostly, they were waiting for the main event. In the center of the room, standing alone and looking very out of place, was an old, upright piano. It was massive and dark, with a finish that had cracked over the years into patterns that looked like dry riverbeds. The ivory keys were yellowed, some chipped, and it looked more like a piece of heavy furniture than an instrument. To everyone in the room, it was just junk. It was taking up space that could be used for something new, something useful. The vote to get rid of it was supposed to be a formality. They had already agreed to sell it for scrap to the first person who would haul it away. But then, the woman stood up. She was younger than most of the people in the room, perhaps in her late 20s. With messy hair pulled back in a clip and a cardigan that looked a bit too big for her, she had been sitting quietly in the corner, her hands twisting together in her lap. When she walked to the center of the room, she didn't walk with the confidence of a politician or a business owner. She walked with the nervous energy of someone who was about to jump into a cold pool. She positioned herself right in front of the piano, placing one hand on the cold wood, as if to steady herself. The chatter in the room didn't stop immediately. It just lowered in volume, like a radio being turned down. The man in charge, a stout man with a red face and a clipboard, looked at her over his glasses. He didn't look angry, just impatient. He had a schedule to keep. "We are on item 4, the disposal of the old furniture," the man said, his voice bored. "If you are here to speak about the new benches for the park, you have the wrong time slot." The woman shook her head quickly. "No, I'm here about the piano," she said. Her voice was shaky at first, quiet, but she forced it to be louder. "I'm here to ask you not to take it." A few people in the chairs exchanged glances. A woman near the front let out a short, sharp sigh. "We have already discussed this, my dear," a man in a suit said from the side. "That instrument is beyond repair. It costs money to tune it, money we don't have. It is essentially a wooden box that is in our way." "It's not just a box," the young woman said. She squeezed the edge of the piano. Her knuckles turned white. "I know what you think of it. I know you think it's junk. But if you get rid of it, if you sell it for scrap, you will be making a terrible mistake." The room became a little quieter. People were sensing a disruption to their routine and they didn't like it. The man in charge sighed louder this time, clicking his pen loudly. "We have a removal team coming in 20 minutes, he said. "Unless you have a truck and 4 strong friends hiding in your pocket, there isn't much you can do to stop it." "I don't have a truck," she said, "and I don't have any money to pay for the storage. But I have a reason why it needs to stay here, at least until I can check it properly." "Check it?" the woman in the front row asked, raising an eyebrow. "Check it for what?" "Termites." A ripple of laughter went through the semicircle of chairs. It wasn't mean laughter exactly, but it was the laughter of people who felt superior. It was the laughter of a group who knew the rules and knew this girl was breaking them. The young woman didn't smile. She looked down at the floor for a second, taking a deep breath. When she looked up, her eyes were intense. She looked at the man in charge, then at the woman who had laughed, and then at the rest of the group. "You think this is just a broken piece of furniture?" she said. "But it's not. My mother, she grew up in this town. She passed away a long time ago when I was very little. But she used to tell me stories about this hall. She told me that she used to come here when she was a girl in the evenings, just to be near this piano." The laughter had died down completely now. The room felt still. The man in charge put his pen down, looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "She told me that she left something important inside it," the woman continued. "It sounds crazy. I know it does. But she made me promise. Before she got too sick to speak, she made me promise that if I ever saw this piano, I had to save it. She said she hid her legacy in there." "Her legacy?" the man in the suit repeated, his voice dripping with doubt. He leaned forward. "What exactly are you claiming is inside that piano? Gold? Diamonds? No, the woman said softly. Something worth more than that. I can't explain it all without looking, but if you let them take it away, and if they smash it up, whatever is inside will be lost forever. And I won't be able to keep the promise I made to her. The silence stretched out. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realizes they are dealing with someone they consider to be irrational. The man in charge picked up his pen again and tapped it against his clipboard. Tap, tap, tap. Look, he said, his voice hardening just a bit. We sympathize with your story. Truly, we are all sorry about your mother. But we cannot run a community center based on ghost stories and promises made to children. This piano is a health and safety hazard. It has sharp edges, and it blocks the fire exit route. He stood up, signaling that the discussion was over. The other committee members shifted in their seats, ready to move on.
Please,
the woman said, her voice cracking. She took a step forward, away from the piano. You don't understand? I'm not asking to keep it here forever. I'm just asking you to wait. Give me 10 minutes. Just let me open the top and look inside the soundboard. If I don't find what she said was there, you can take it. I'll help you carry it out myself. The man in charge looked at his watch. He looked at the woman. He looked at the piano. He shook his head slowly. We have a schedule, he said. The truck is waiting. We can't delay the entire day on a hunch. If I'm wrong, she said, her voice rising in desperation. But what if I'm right? What if you throw away the only thing left of her history like it was garbage? It is garbage, the woman in the front row muttered, just loud enough to be heard. That's the point. The words hit the young woman like a physical blow. She flinched slightly. She looked around the room and saw the looks on their faces. They weren't seeing a grieving daughter or a keeper of secrets. They were seeing a nuisance. They were seeing someone who was wasting their time with fairy tales. She turned back to the piano. She ran her hand along the dusty side. It felt solid and indifferent to her touch. To them, it was a block of wood waiting to be chopped. To her, it was a safe that she didn't know how to open. I'm not moving, she said, though her voice was quieter now. She planted her feet. You can't make me move. The man in charge sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to deflate his whole body. He didn't want to deal with this. He didn't want a scene. He walked over to the wall and pressed the button on the intercom. Jerry, he said into the speaker, go ahead and bring the dolly in. We have a situation here. Turned back to the room, his face set in stone. He looked at the young woman standing by the piano, looking small and alone against the giant instrument. You have until Jerry gets here, the man said. Then this is over. The young woman looked at the double doors at the back of the hall. She knew that Jerry was the removal guy. She knew she had minutes, maybe less. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She felt the tears stinging her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't cry. Not in front of them. They would just say she was being emotional. They would say it proved she was unstable. She looked back at the committee members. They were checking their phones again, already dismissing her. They didn't believe her, not even for a second. To them, the only thing inside that piano was dust and mouse droppings. They were ready to laugh her out of the room or have security drag her out. The tension in the air was tight, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. She took a deep breath and put her hands on the keyboard cover, ready to fight for a memory that she wasn't even sure was real. The silence that followed the man's announcement didn't last long. It was shattered by the sound of heavy boots against the tiled floor. The double doors at the back of the hall swung open, and a man in a blue work uniform walked in. He was pushing a heavy metal dolly, the wheels clanking loudly over the floor seams. He didn't look at the committee members or the girl standing by the piano. He just looked at the instrument, checking its weight and size, like a butcher eyeing a side of beef. The girl stood her ground. She didn't move an inch, even when the worker stopped right beside her. He smelled of tobacco and grease. He looked at the man in charge, waiting for the signal. The girl could feel the heavy presence of the machinery next to her. It made the stakes feel incredibly real. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was about to become a physical removal. The man in charge sat back down, looking satisfied that the situation was under control. He looked at the girl, his expression expecting her to step aside now that the real world had entered the room. "You can stop this right now," he said, tapping his pen on the table again. "Let Jerry do his job and we can all go home." The girl didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the piano keys. "I told you," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "There is something inside here. You can't just take it." This was the moment the room had been waiting for, though they didn't know it. The shift from annoyance to pure, unfiltered disbelief. The man in the suit, the one who had spoken earlier, let out a laugh. It was a sharp, barking sound that cut through the tension. "Inside the piano?" he repeated, turning to the woman next to him. "Is she serious? What could possibly be inside a piano that isn't strings and hammers?" "Maybe she thinks a ghost lives in it," the woman replied, not even bothering to lower her voice. A few chuckles rippled through the semicircle of chairs. It was an ugly sound, the sound of people bonding over the mockery of someone else. The girl's face turned red. She could feel the heat rising up her neck. She turned to face them, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She knew she sounded crazy. She knew that if she hadn't lived through it, she would be skeptical too. But she needed them to understand. She needed just one person to believe her, or at least to respect her enough to let her try. "It's not a ghost," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "It's papers, letters, music. My mother told me about it before she died. She hid them in the felt, near the top tuning pins. She said she put them there for safekeeping." It wasn't just a giggle anymore. It was open ridicule. The man in charge shook his head, looking at her with a mixture of pity and irritation. "Music. In the felt?" he asked, as if she had just claimed the moon was made of cheese. "Do you have any idea how pianos are built? Do you know how many technicians have tuned that thing over the last 40 years? Do you think they wouldn't have noticed a stack of papers? They wouldn't have looked," she insisted. "It's hidden in a way you wouldn't see unless you were looking for it. Please, just give me 10 minutes to open the lid." "There is no lid to open that we haven't already seen," the man in the suit said, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye. "We opened it last year for the Christmas concert. It was empty. It was just a dusty old box." "That was the fallboard," she said desperately. "I mean the top lid. The prop stick holds it up. There are felt liners inside the rim. You have to reach deep inside." She reached out and grabbed the prop stick, trying to lift the heavy wooden lid that covered the strings. It was stiff and heavy, stuck by years of humidity and lack of use. She grunted, trying to pull it up, but it wouldn't budge. "See?" the man in charge said, pointing at her struggle with his pen. "Even the piano is telling you to give up. It's stuck shut." "Let me help you with that, honey," the worker, Jerry, said. He stepped forward, not out of kindness, but because the piano was in his way. He grabbed the lid with a gloved hand and yanked it up hard. It groaned in protest and flew open, slamming against the hinge stop. The sudden loud noise made a few people jump, but then they relaxed. The worker stepped back, putting his hands on his hips, waiting for her to make a fool of herself so he could get on with his job. The girl reached into the dark cavity of the piano. It smelled of old wood and dry dust. She ran her hands along the green felt strips that lined the rim. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She felt the eyes of every person in the room burning into her back. She felt their smirks and their rolling eyes. It was a heavy weight, heavier than the piano lid. She felt along the iron plate. She felt the strings. Nothing, just empty space. She pushed her hand deeper awkwardly, her arm brushing against the cold copper wires. "Are you finding any gold bars yet?" The woman in the front row called out. Another wave of laughter washed over the girl. It felt like drowning. She was standing on a stage, performing for an audience that wanted her to fail. They weren't just indifferent. They were enjoying her distress. It made them feel smart. It made them feel superior to watch this girl chase a fantasy. "Maybe she's looking for a hidden pizza," someone else whispered loudly from the back. "I'm getting hungry." The girl ignored them. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to remember exactly what her mother had described. She remembered the rainy afternoons, the smell of her mother's tea, the raspy voice. Asterisk, inside the rim, baby. Where the bass notes sing, I put it where the dust gathers. Asterisk, she shifted her position, reaching toward the bass side, the left side of the piano. Her fingers danced over the thick, felt-covered dampers. She felt nothing but rough texture. Panic started to set in. What if they were right? What if her mother had just made up the story to comfort her before she died? What if she was just a crazy woman harassing a school board meeting for no reason? I don't feel anything, the girl whispered, mostly to herself. Well, that settles it, the man in charge said, standing up. He buttoned his jacket. Jerry, if you would please. The worker moved back to the dolly. He grabbed the straps to wrap around the piano legs. No, wait, the girl said. Just wait. She wasn't reaching for the piano anymore. She was just standing there, blocking the path. Her shoulders slumped. The defiance was draining out of her, replaced by a crushing sense of humiliation. She looked around the room. They were all looking at their phones or their watches. They were done. They had given her a chance in their minds, and she had produced nothing but dust. Listen, the man in charge said, his voice dropping to a tone that was meant to be gentle, but came off as condescending. I understand you miss your mother. Really, I do? Everyone here has lost someone. But you can't disrupt a public meeting because of a story. This isn't healthy. She didn't lie, the girl said, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She wiped them away angrily, smearing her makeup. She didn't lie to me. She didn't mean to, the woman in the front row said, her voice sickeningly sweet. Old people get confused. They remember things that never happened. It's sad, but it's true. It was the final straw. They weren't just mocking her claim. They were calling her mother a liar, or worse, senile. The girl felt a flash of anger cut through the shame. You don't know her, she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. She was the smartest person I ever knew. She wouldn't make this up. She hid it because she knew people like you wouldn't value it. She knew you would just throw it away like trash. The room went dead silent for a second, shocked by her outburst. But then the man in charge laughed, a short, dismissive sound. People like me, he asked, raising an eyebrow. You mean people who pay taxes and keep this building running? Yes, we tend to throw away trash. That is our job. And Jerry here is very good at it. He nodded to the worker. Jerry stepped forward, his bulk filling the space between the girl and the piano. Ma'am, Jerry said, I need you to step aside. I don't want to hurt you, but I have a schedule. He reached out to take her arm, gently but firmly, to move her out of the way. The girl looked at his hand, then at the piano, then at the room full of faces that were turned against her. The laughter had stopped, but the mockery hung in the air like a bad smell. They were waiting for her to break. They were waiting for her to run out of the room, crying so they could get back to their coffee and their important paperwork. She felt small. She felt alone. The weight of their judgment was pressing down on her, trying to force her to her knees. It would be so easy to just step aside, to let them win. To go home and admit that the world was just a cold place where memories didn't matter. But then she looked at the dark, open cavity of the piano one last time. She saw the way the light hit the dusty strings. She thought of her mother's hands, playing those keys, hiding a piece of her soul in the dark. She didn't move. She planted her feet harder. She looked Jerry in the eye. No, she said. Excuse me? The man in charge asked, stepping closer. I said no, she repeated. You can mock me. You can call me crazy, but you are not taking this piano. Not until I say so. The worker named Jerry didn't seem angry. He just looked tired. He had been moving heavy furniture all day, and he didn't get paid enough to deal with weeping girls or dramatic arguments. He wiped his hands on his blue coveralls and looked over at the man with the red face, waiting for instructions. The room felt incredibly still, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that happens right before a storm breaks. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see who would back down first. The man in charge didn't back down. He stood up from his chair, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. He walked down the small aisle until he was standing right in front of the girl. He wasn't a tall man, but in that moment, he seemed to loom over her. He carried the authority of the committee, the budget, and the clock on the wall. "You are making a very big mistake," he said, his voice low and hard. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "You are interfering with city employees. You are delaying a scheduled procedure. If you do not step aside right now, I will have to call security to remove you." The girl didn't move. She was trembling so hard that her cardigan was shaking, but her feet were glued to the floor. She looked at the man, then at the other people sitting in their plastic chairs. They were watching her with a mix of confusion and irritation. The woman in the front row had her arms crossed tightly, shaking her head slowly. To them, this wasn't a standoff. It was a tantrum. "What security then?" the girl said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was steady. "I'm not moving." The man in charge let out a long, frustrated sigh that seemed to deflate his entire chest. He rubbed his temples with his fingers. He looked at his watch, then back at her. "For what?" he asked, throwing his hands up. "For a ghost story? For a feeling? Look around you. Does this look like a library? Does this look like a museum? It is a community hall. We need this space for classes. We need the floor space. This piano is dead. It has been dead for 20 years. Nothing you find inside it is going to change that." "It's not about the piano being alive," she said, tears still tracking through the powder on her face. "It's about respect. You have no respect for what this room used to be. You only care about your schedule." "We have a duty to the people who live here now," he shot back. "Not the people who lived here 50 years ago. We can't save every dusty item just because someone might be attached to it. If we did, this whole building would be a warehouse." He took a step closer, invading her personal space, trying to intimidate her into moving. Jerry, the worker, shifted his weight awkwardly. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The people in the chairs started murmuring again. Someone suggested they just call the police. Someone else said they should just pick the piano up with the girl still holding on to it. The girl felt the walls closing in. She looked at Jerry's big, calloused hands resting on the side of the piano. She thought about the piano being strapped to that dolly, wheeled out the back door, and thrown into a truck. She thought about the heavy trash compressor at the landfill, crunching the wood and the strings and whatever secrets were hiding inside. The image made her stomach turn over. She couldn't let it happen. She wouldn't be able to live with herself. If she walked away now, she turned away from the man in charge and faced the open piano again. The dark cavity stared back at her, looking empty and mocking. She knew she had sounded crazy. She knew she had no proof. But she also knew that her mother had never lied to her about the important things. "Just let me check the felt one more time," she pleaded, turning back to the room. "That's all I'm asking. 2 minutes. If I find nothing, I will walk out of this room, and you will never see me again." "Well," the man in charge said flatly, "we played that game. You had your time. You put your hands in there, and you found dust. Now it is over." He gestured to Jerry. "Jerry, secure the instrument." Jerry nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy roll of packing tape. He leaned over the keyboard to start taping the fallboard shut so it wouldn't fly open during transport. "No," the girl screamed. It wasn't a shout. It was a raw, primal sound of panic. Before anyone could react, she lunged forward. She didn't try to push Jerry. She didn't try to hit the man in charge. She threw herself over the open keyboard, draping her upper body across the keys, pressing her chest against the cold wood. Her arms stretched out deep into the piano, hugging the frame. A dissonant, jarring cluster of notes rang out as her elbows hit the keys, a loud, ugly noise that made everyone in the room wince. "Get her off of there." The woman in the front row shrieked. "Jerry, careful!" the man in charge barked, stepping forward anxiously. He didn't want a lawsuit. "Don't hurt her. Just get her out." Jerry reached down and gently grabbed the girl's shoulder. "Come on, miss," he said. "Don't make this hard. You're going to hurt yourself. Get off me." The girl cried, trying to shake him off, but she was trapped awkwardly over the piano. She couldn't move without letting go of the string she was gripping inside. "You can't take it. I won't let you." The room was in chaos. The committee members were on their feet, shouting orders and complaints. The man in charge was yelling at Jerry to be careful. Through it all, the girl lay across the piano, her face pressed against the dusty wood, sobbing now. She felt like a small animal trapped in a corner, baring its teeth even though it knew it was going to lose. She felt the hands grabbing at her clothes, felt the strength of the worker trying to pull her away. But then, something happened. As Jerry pulled on her shoulder, the girl shifted her weight. Her hand, which was deep in the bass side of the piano, slipped. Her palm scraped against the rough iron plate, and her fingers slid down behind a wooden beam that supported the pin block. It wasn't the smooth wood she had felt before. It was something different, something sharp. She froze. Even through the shouting and the pulling, she felt it. It was a texture that didn't belong. It was paper. Dry, brittle paper, taped to the wood. The girl stopped fighting. She went limp for a second, confusing Jerry. He loosened his grip, thinking she had given up. "I felt something," she gasped, her voice muffled against the piano. "Oh, for crying out loud," the man in charge said. "She's hallucinating," the girl said. She twisted her head, looking up at the man standing over her. Her eyes were wild, rimmed with red, but they were burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "I felt it. My hand is on it right now." She pushed herself up slightly, ignoring Jerry's hands. She craned her neck to see where her hand was disappearing into the darkness of the instrument. "It's here," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "It's right here." The man in charge stopped. He looked at the woman, then at Jerry. The shouting from the committee members died down into a confused murmur. The shift in the girl's demeanor was so sudden, so absolute, that it gave them pause. She wasn't looking crazy anymore. She looked like someone who had found water in a desert. "Get back, Jerry," the man in charge said slowly, waving his hand. Jerry let go of her shoulder and stepped back, crossing his arms. He looked skeptical, but he didn't touch her again. The girl slowly pulled her hand out of the piano. It was covered in black dust and cobwebs, but held tightly between her thumb and forefinger was a corner of a yellowed envelope. As she pulled, she heard the distinct, dry sound of packing tape tearing away from the wood after decades of silence. The sound was tiny, but in the quiet room, it sounded like a thunderclap. She sat up, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She held the envelope up. It was brown, discolored by age, and brittle around the edges. There was writing on the front, faded but legible. The room held its breath. The mockery was gone. The annoyance was gone. Every single pair of eyes in the room was fixed on that dirty piece of paper, clutched in the girl's dusty hand. The girl didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the man in charge. She looked at the name written on the envelope. It was her mother's handwriting. She recognized the loops of the L and the way she crossed her T's. She carefully broke the seal. It cracked like a dry leaf. Inside, there wasn't just one paper. There was a stack. She pulled them out, her hands shaking. Sheets of music handwritten in black ink, and on top, a photograph, black and white, curled at the edges. The man in charge leaned forward, squinting. "What? What is that?" he asked, his voice lacking the certainty it had just moments before. The girl didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the photograph. It was a picture of her mother, young and beautiful, sitting on the bench of this very piano, laughing at the camera. She held the photo up to the room, a silent victory, a proof of life that silenced every single skeptic. The room was so quiet that the only sound was the rustling of the old paper as the girl's hands shook. It was a brittle, dry sound, like dead leaves skittering across a sidewalk. Just a minute ago, the air had been filled with shouting, orders, and the impatience of people who wanted to go home. Now, it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the space. The silence was heavy. It pressed against their ears, demanding that they look and listen. The girl stared at the photograph in her hand. It was small, black and white, with the edges curled from years of being hidden in a dry, dark place. The image was slightly faded, but the face in the picture was clear. It was a young woman sitting on the bench of this very piano, her fingers poised over the keys, looking back over her shoulder with a brilliant, carefree smile. The girl knew that smile. She had seen it in albums, but never in a context like this. This wasn't a posed portrait in a studio. It was a candid moment captured in this very hall. She felt a lump form in her throat that was so big it hurt to swallow. Her mother looked so alive in the photo. She looked like she had the whole world ahead of her. The girl slowly turned the photograph around to face the room. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The evidence was right there in her hand. The man in charge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. He was still standing over her, his body tense, but the aggression had drained out of his posture. He stared at the photo. Then he looked at the piano. Then he looked back at the girl. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. The woman in the front row, the one who had been so quick to mock and sigh, stood up. She gripped the back of her chair until her knuckles turned white. She squinted at the image. Her face, which had been twisted in annoyance just moments before, now looked pale and uncertain. "That looks like the old room," the woman whispered, her voice sounding strangely small. "Look at the curtains in the background. They changed those in the 80s. The girl nodded slowly. "It was taken here," she said, her voice raspy from crying. 42 years ago. She wrote the date on the back. She carefully flipped the photo over using only her fingertips so she wouldn't damage the paper. She showed it to the room. In faded pencil, the handwriting read, "*, my first concerto, June 12th. The day I finally felt heard." *, a murmur ran through the semicircle of chairs. It wasn't laughter anymore. It was the sound of confusion shifting into shock. The man in the suit, who had made jokes about ghosts and gold bars, stopped tapping his pen. He just sat there, staring at the girl's hand. "But how?" the man in charge asked, finally finding his voice. He sounded less like a boss now and more like a confused student. "We opened that lid. We tuned it. We moved it." "It was taped to the inside of the support beam," the girl explained, turning back to look at the dark cavity of the piano. "It was hidden behind the felt, right up against the iron plate. You wouldn't see it unless you reached in blindly. Unless you knew exactly where to look." She reached back into the bundle she was holding. Underneath the photograph were several sheets of paper. These were different. They were thicker, more textured. The girl unfolded the top one with trembling hands. It was sheet music, hand-drawn. The notes were scribbled in black ink, frantic and hurried, with crossed-out sections and frantic scribbles in the margins. It looked like the work of someone composing in a fury of inspiration. The girl held the sheets up. The title at the top was written in large, sweeping letters, *, the silent room. *, my mother wrote this, the girl said, looking at the man in charge. She told me about this piece. She said she played it once the night she wrote it, and then she put it away because it was too personal. She said it belonged to this room. She said as long as the piano stayed here, the music was safe. But if the piano left, the music would die. She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. You were about to throw away the only copy of her music in the world. You were about to turn it into landfill trash because you were in a hurry. The guilt in the room was palpable. It hung over the committee members like a gray cloud. The man in charge looked down at his shoes. He shuffled his feet. He looked at the clock on the wall, then quickly away, as if the time was suddenly a shameful thing. I didn't know, he mumbled. There was no triumph in her voice, only sadness. I tried to tell you, but you didn't want to hear me. You just saw a girl in a messy cardigan making a scene. You didn't see a person. You saw a problem. She put the photograph on top of the music and hugged the papers against her chest. She looked at Jerry, the worker. Jerry was standing by his dolly, his arms crossed. He wasn't looking at the committee. He was looking at the girl. He had removed his hat and was holding it in his hands, twisting the brim. He looked uncomfortable, but there was a new respect in his eyes. "I'm glad I didn't move it, miss," Jerry said, breaking the silence. "I would have felt bad if I knew there was a lady's picture inside." "Thank you, Jerry," the girl whispered. The man in the suit stood up. He buttoned his jacket, a nervous habit. Is it any good?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the sheet music. "The music, I mean, is it valuable?" The girl looked down at the frantic notes on the page. She didn't know much about music theory, but she knew the story behind the notes. She knew the heartbreak and the joy that went into every ink stroke. "It's worth more than money," she said. "It's a piece of history. It's proof that she was real, that she mattered." She turned away from them and walked back to the piano bench. She sat down heavily, feeling the exhaustion of the last 20 minutes crashing down on her. She carefully laid the papers out on the music rack. The photograph stood up against the lamp. "I want to play it," she said to the room. The man in charge looked up, startled. "We can't have a concert now." "The meeting." "I'm not asking for a concert," she interrupted him. "I just want to play a few bars. I want to hear her voice one last time in this room. Then I will pack up her things, and I will leave, and you can do whatever you want with the piano." She placed her hands on the keys. They were cold and dirty, but to her, they felt like holy ground. She took a deep breath. She wasn't a concert pianist. She knew enough to play a simple tune, enough to understand the language her mother spoke. This piece looked complex, but the first few chords were simple enough. Slow, heavy chords that echoed the heartbeat of the room. She pressed down. The sound that came out was terrible. The strings were rusty, the hammers were worn, and the piano was dreadfully out of tune. It was a thumping, rasping noise that would have made a music teacher cover their ears. But in that hall, at that moment, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. The girl played the first 4 measures. Bum, bum, bum. The notes drifted through the air, dusty and imperfect. As the sound faded into the rafters, the girl felt a sudden rush of peace. She had kept her promise. She had saved her mother's secret. She had made them listen. She lifted her hands off the keys. The final vibration of the string hummed in the air and then stopped. The room was silent again. But this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of judgment. It was the silence of awe. The woman in the front row had tears in her eyes. The man in charge was standing perfectly still, his hands resting on the table in front of him, looking at the piano as if he was seeing it. For the first time, the girl stood up and carefully gathered the papers and the photograph. She held them close to her heart. "I think we're done here," she said quietly. She turned and walked toward the exit. The double doors were still open. As she passed the chairs, nobody stopped her. Nobody made a joke. Nobody checked their watch. They just watched her go, a young woman carrying a heavy history in her arms, leaving behind a room that would never be quite the same again. The heavy doors clicked shut behind the girl, but the sound seemed to echo in the air like a gunshot. For a long time, nobody in the room moved. It was as if the entire committee had been turned to stone. The dust motes dancing in the light from the high windows looked like the only things alive in the entire building. The girl was gone, but the weight of what had just happened remained. Pressing down on the plastic chairs and the tiled floor, the man in charge stood frozen by his table, his hand still hovering over his clipboard. He looked at the empty doorway, then down at his paperwork, then finally at the piano. The instrument sat there, silent and imposing. It hadn't changed. The wood was still chipped, the varnish was still cracked, and the keys were still yellowed. But in the eyes of everyone in the room, it had transformed. It was no longer a piece of junk taking up space. It was a coffin that had just been opened, releasing a ghost that they had tried to silence. Jerry, the worker, was the first to break the stillness. He let out a long, low breath and scratched the back of his neck. He looked at the dolly, then at the man in charge. And then he slowly walked over and took the packing tape he had stuck to the side of the piano. He peeled it off and threw it in the trash bin. "Well," Jerry said, his voice rumbling in the quiet room, "I ain't moving that today." The man in charge blinked, as if waking up from a trance. He looked at Jerry, confused for a second. "The schedule," he mumbled automatically. "We have to clear the room." "Room is cleared," Jerry said simply. He gestured toward the empty chairs. "She's gone. And you heard her. That music. That was personal. You move it now, and you're the villain in a story that everyone in this town is going to hear about by tomorrow morning." The man in the suit, who had been so confident earlier, stood up. He smoothed his tie, but his hands were unsteady. "He's right," the man said quietly. "We can't touch it. Not after what she showed us." A ripple of agreement went through the few remaining people. The woman in the front row, the one who had sighed and checked her phone, was now sitting very still. She was staring at the empty music rack where the girl had placed the photograph just minutes ago. "I felt it," the woman whispered, so softly that the others had to lean in to hear her. "When she played those notes, it sounded terrible. The piano is in awful shape, but it felt real. It felt like this room was finally being used for what it was built for." "We treated her terribly," another committee member added, sounding guilty. "We laughed at her. We treated her like a nuisance, and all she wanted to do was save a memory." The man in charge looked down at his hands. He felt a cold knot of shame in his stomach. He liked to think of himself as a reasonable man, a man who followed the rules and did what was best for the community. But today, he had been the bully. He had been the one who tried to crush a young girl's spirit to save 10 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. That was a heavy feeling to carry. "We didn't know," the man in charge said, trying to defend himself. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We didn't listen." The woman in the front row corrected him sharply. "That's the problem. We never listen. We are so busy worrying about budgets and schedules that we forget about the people who actually live here." She stood up, picking up her purse. She walked over to the piano. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the chipped wood with a new sense of reverence. She reached out and touched the fallboard, the same place the girl had hugged just moments ago. "My mother played too," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not here. But in a church just like this one. She's gone now. I gave her piano away because nobody wanted it. I sold it for $50 at a garage sale." She turned to look at the man in charge, her eyes glistening. "If that girl had walked in here with a story about my mother, I would have torn this place apart to save it too." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was a silence of reflection. The man in charge looked at the instrument and realized that the junk in the center of the room was actually a time machine. It connected the past to the present, and by trying to destroy it, they had been trying to sever that connection. "We need to fix it," the man in charge said suddenly. The room looked at him. "The piano," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We can't just leave it like this, and we certainly can't sell it for scrap. If that girl's mother wrote music for this specific instrument, if this is where her soul is, then we have a responsibility to take care of it. It will cost a fortune," the man in the suit said, though he didn't sound like he was objecting anymore. He sounded curious. "Then we find the money," the man in charge said. He snapped his clipboard shut. The sound was final. "We cancel the order for the new plastic chairs. We hold a bake sale, a fundraiser, whatever it takes. We get a technician in here. We tune it. We fix the sticky keys. We make this room sound the way it did when that photograph was taken." He walked over to where the girl had been standing. He looked down at the floor, imagining the girl's desperate struggle to save the piano. He realized then that the girl hadn't just saved a piano. She had saved them. She had saved them from becoming the kind of people who destroy history just to make things easier. "What about the girl?" Jerry asked. "What about her music?" The man in charge looked at the empty doorway again. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she lived. But he knew that she had left something behind that was bigger than a stack of papers. "She will come back," the man in charge said, with a certainty that surprised him. "She knows it's safe now. And when we get this piano fixed, when it can actually sing again, We will find her. We will tell her we are sorry. And we will invite her back to play the concert her mother never got to have." The woman in the front row smiled. It was a genuine smile, the first real smile that had been seen in that meeting all day. "I'd like to hear that," she said. "I think I'd pay to hear that." Slowly, the group began to gather their things. The mood was lighter, but it was a sober kind of lightness. They felt like they had survived a storm. They walked out of the room, chatting in low voices about tuners and felt replacement and the history of the town. One by one, the lights were turned off. The room dimmed, settling into the shadows of the evening. But the piano remained in the center. It was no longer just a dark shape in the gloom. In the quiet of the empty hall, the old instrument seemed to hum with a new energy. It wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was filled with a promise. Outside, the wind picked up, but the girl was already gone. Walking down the street with the precious papers tucked safely under her arm, her heart lighter than it had been in years. And inside, the piano waited, patient and still, ready for the day when the music would return. The room was empty, but it wasn't lonely. It was just waiting for the next song to begin.